Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here with us. When we thought of that event jointly with Jan Sveinar, whom we're partnering with SIPA and Brookings, this is a jointly sponsored event, jointly organized event. We didn't know that Theresa May would call an election on the 8th of June. So it's not no unfairness vis-à-vis the UK that we focused on the French in the title on the French and the German elections. There are other elections, of course, around the world, but of course now we have the British election added to the French and the German ones in a very, very short period, and then of course there's Italy and there are other countries coming later. But instead of focusing too narrowly on France and Germany, we've decided to focus a little more broadly on the world economy as such. Anne Kruger is Senior Research Professor of International Economics at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Development, and Emeritus Professor of Sciences and Humanities in the Economics Department at Stanford. We introduced these panelists, but none of them really need an introduction, but tradition has it that we do introduce it. She served as first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF and as World Bank Chief Economist. In both jobs, she was my boss. Boss in the sense of not boss in the sense of directly, but having a huge influence on the way I worked and the way we worked together. Anne has taught widely, including at Stanford and Duke, and is a prolific scholar and author. Joe Stiglitz is a professor at Columbia University, the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Among his many positions, he is co-founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, and he co-chairs the OECD's high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress. Joe was World Bank chief economist, again, my boss at the time, and also headed the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. He was awarded the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics and has authored many books, the most recent one having a great bearing on the discussion today, The Euro, How a Common Currency Threatens the Future of Europe. As I said yesterday in a different panel, it's not really an anti-Euro book, but it's more a book of how the Euro can function if it is going to function as a currency of sovereign nations. Jan Sveinar is the James T. Shotwell Professor of Global Political Economy and Director of the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia University. He founded and co-chairs CGEG in Prague, and he serves as coordinator of economics of transition. He holds several fellowships, including with the European Economic Association and the Center for Economic Policy Research in London and the Institute for Study of Labor, ISA, in Bonn. Jan has held many eminent positions in the Czech Republic, where he also ran for president, which wasn't in the short bio, but I think it's a unique experience one can have.
That's for sure.
And Jan has held many eminent positions in the Czech Republic, and he has taught widely, including at Michigan, Pittsburgh, and Cornell. He's also a widely published author. So thanks for being here. I'm going to hand it over soon to Jan to give the first few introductory remarks and give his perspective. But let me stress that these elections that are coming in France in 2 days are really very, very crucial importance. The four candidates are very different from each other, to say the least, and the polls are highly volatile. So we are two days before the election, but few people are very confident about what the outcome could be, and yet the difference in terms of the outcome is huge. I want to also really regret and express my sympathy for the people who were hurt yesterday in Paris, as so many lives have been lost around the world in the last few months, before then also, but particularly in the last few months. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Jan, who will say also some welcoming word. Then I'll come back to me to Anne, and then to Joe. Okay?
Very good. So let me co-welcome you, since as Kemal mentioned, this is a joint project of the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia and Brookings. We do things together every now and then, sometime in New York City, sometimes here. And this indeed came together as an idea, saying, well, we will meet here at the time when the elections will be looming. The Dutch election took place, but the French election, which clearly is pivotal, taking place on Sunday, the first round, and then May 7th, the second round, if it comes to the second round, which it probably will. And more broadly, Europe really is at a crossroads, and not only Europe, the world in general is at a crossroads. But focusing on Europe, obviously Brexit was a big surprise, and the short-term effects have not been very noticeable, but I think the medium to long-term effects can be very significant. Now with the general elections called in Britain, that will obviously have its own evolution and impact on how Brexit is negotiated. I think overall positive note is that the world economy is finally beginning to look like it's growing, and over the last 5-6 years, all the predictions proved to be too optimistic and always have to be downgraded in terms of world growth and how various parts of the world were doing. Now we have an overall more positive picture. Looks like, at least in the short run, growth could resume in many, if not most parts of the world, but the degree of uncertainty has increased dramatically. And in some sense, the political uncertainty is what's so serious. So in France, let's start with that part, on top of Brexit, which has, of course, given many of the more extreme movements and parties food for thought in terms of what they themselves could strive for and go for. So here we indeed have an extreme candidate, Marine Le Pen, who is one of the two front runners who indeed would like to get France out of Euro, or do away with Euro, and have a referendum relating to possible exit of France from the European Union. And here, I think, if that were to happen, I think that would shake the entire European project in its foundations, and it's not clear whether it would survive or it would unravel, and certainly would help other extreme movements and leaders in that area. I think that what we are observing, as Kemal mentioned, is actually the top 4 candidates, which, by the way, don't include the Socialist Party candidates, so that's also an interesting comment on the French situation in French politics, are so close right now, and such a high proportion of voters are undecided that it's really very difficult to predict. We could take a poll at the end as to what you are thinking, who is going to win. But it really is very, very difficult. And it's not at all excluded that, for instance, the two most extreme candidates from extreme right, extreme left could run against each other, which would be really something which still a few weeks ago was not expected, because Mélenchon was far back and now is actually catching up and apparently doing extremely well recently in the polls. So the situation in France, in terms of where it would go politically, where it would go economically, most of the candidates, again, Fillon on the right as well as Le Pen, are very much against immigration, for instance. There is a big difference in terms of budget and approach to spending policies. So France is really in a state where it's very difficult to predict which way it would go, which way it will go. The German election, on the other hand, which will take place later in the year, is in some sense less consequential, but also extremely interesting in the sense that it looks like Angela Merkel will have to fight seriously to retain her chancellorship, because Martin Schulz, the new leader of the Social Democratic Party, is actually doing very well, and right now the polls are bringing them very close together. So there it's going to be a question of who will lead after that election. On the other hand, less consequential, what I meant by that is that it's very likely that the grand coalition that is there now between Angela Merkel's party and the Social Democratic Party is likely to be renewed, because it's going to be more difficult, very likely more difficult, to form other type of coalition, because it looks like two new parties, including the extreme right Alternative for Germany, will make it into the parliament, and one may need three-party coalitions, if it's not the grand coalition, in order to form a governing coalition that doesn't have just few votes, few extra votes. So that in Germany, in some sense, may have a different formation as to who leads and who is the junior partner in the coalition. But on the other hand, the outcomes don't look to be as wildly diverse as we can expect in France, depending on who wins. But I think the two elections are linked in the more subtle sense. Now I'm returning to economics, or economic part of it, in that we may have either a continuation of quite conservative fiscal policies directed from Germany, and that's represented now by Finance Minister Schäuble together with Angela Merkel. But if the Social Democratic Party were to be the leading party and they have the Ministry of Finance, it could be quite different, especially if the winner in France was, for instance, the centrist candidate Macron, who by many counts perhaps has a slight edge over anybody else. So in that sense, which way Europe will go, how it will handle the situation in the Eurozone, how it will handle the northern versus the southern divergence in performance, economic performance that has been there, and that is the Achilles heel, really, of the entire European project. That will hinge very much on how these two elections actually together will form. And I think that and I'll turn it back to Kemal now, what's very interesting when you follow the European political and economic developments is how relatively what might look like minor problems in different perspectives can affect what Europe is and isn't capable of doing. And in particular, the example I have in mind is Greece. So the Greek economy is less than 2%, it's closer to 1% of Europe's total GDP. So it's almost like a rounding error, right? And yet the problem has not been resolved. The Europeans have not been able to resolve the Greek problem for over 5, 6, 7 years now. And it threatened and still threatens to derail the entire project, right? So the incapacity to lead and really form a functioning union is something that is remarkable in so far what Europe has done. And the outcome of these two elections will be really determining which way it will go in the future.
Thank you, Jan, for these introductory remarks. Let me just add a few things before turning it over to Anne Krüger and Joe Stiglitz. I want to maybe draw attention to three points. And of course, we want to very much talk about this also in the context of the US political debate, because the US elections, of course, took place. The administration took over in January, but I think the actual debate on specifically which policies, what kind of tax reform, what kind of trade policy regime, these things are still in formation. I mean, one can guess, and there are certain signals, of course, that are, some of them quite strong, but the actual legislation, the actual policy, the way the US will really be run over the next 3.5 years is still not that clear, and has quite an impact, of course, also on Europe. And the other common denominator that is kind of tragicomic is that Putin seems to be involved everywhere in one way or another. So the U.S. After the U.S. debate, there's now a big debate in France on how much he's been influencing certain polls and certain analysis. But anyway, having said that, and so that the U.S. is very much part of the debate, I think what we would like to address and hear from two really foremost experts in the world, Anne and Joe, in terms of the world economy, is how they see it going. Jan said that, and I think it's the eight times the IMF WEO downgraded growth rates. They don't only do it once a year. It's not that they did it for 8 years, but and this time it is slightly upgraded, more than slightly upgraded in terms of the actual realization of 2016, compared to what is projected for 2017. Of course, 2017 is also a projection, it's not a realization, but there the difference is of almost half a percentage point for the world economy, which is very important, driven by mainly by the US, by the difference in the US, Japan, the UK, and to some degree India, when you take the weight of the country and the size of the difference into account. Africa also, thankfully, the fact that so many people last year were thinking that China was near collapse, not collapse, but the growth rate would dramatically decline in China has turned out to be wrong, and therefore the kind of the feedback on Africa is particularly positive in terms of that link. But having said that, I want to draw attention really to two points that I hope will come out of the discussion. The debate. What is the debate really about? Is it just personalities that can formulate almost any kind of policy program they can think of, and in the end, modern democracy is bringing us to a clash of personalities and the way they project personally, which would be, I mean, the personalities were very, very important, but for example, in France, it's very, in the US, it's clear that President Trump did not have a political past. In France, Macron, who's one of the leading candidates and who has a good chance of actually winning in the end, one has to remind people also that, in fact, he never got elected ever in his life. I'm not saying this at all as a negative factor, but it is interesting that modern democracy can produce candidates that in a way come from outside the political system. In the U.S., it's business that has produced it. In France, it's more in that sense. Macron is more of an established elite candidate, although he is a not part of the political elite, but of the intellectual elite of the country, if you like. But he is also somebody who really has no political base, really, that he has built over time from which he emerges. So are we moving to a much more personalized kind of situation? Even in Germany, I mean, it turns out that the polls are volatile, but when Martin Schulz declared his candidacy, the SPD almost, within a week, gained 10, 12 points in the polls. So it's again an example of how a single personality can change a lot in what appears to be modern politics. And I think one can give examples of that also from the developing countries and the emerging countries. But the second question is, when I was a student, or when I was, that was a very long time ago, or 30, 40 years ago during the debate, economic ideology, in a sense, played a very, very important role. One was on the left or on the right. The left had an ideological program that was very, very, very different from that of the right. Is that still a constituent force in the debates we're seeing in the US and in Europe? In France, and that's why France is a particularly good example of that, Emmanuel Macron's intellectual home is more the left, the center left. He, however, proclaims to be neither left nor right, a centrist candidate, and has made a lot of headway that way. His policies, when you look at it, are centrist policies. They're neither a sweeping move to the left or a sweeping move to the right. They're changes, they're important changes. In that sense, it's not at all the same system continuing. There are important changes proposed for pensions. There are important changes proposed for the labor market, for the retirement system, the way it works, not the age per se or the amount, but the way it works. And so there are specific points in the program that make it very different from the other parts of the program. But among the candidates that come to mind, he is one that tries to, in a sense, assume social liberalism, which in the Socialist Party in France was still very much considered a very debatable word and not a very good label to have. The Socialist Party in France was debating actually between socialist and social democrat more than that. Social liberal was not a something that people were ready to assume. So in a sense, he's trying to define a movement which appeals to the whole of society, not to a particular part of society. And some of his supporters, and he himself sometimes, although he's more modest in his declarations, sees that this is the future in a way, that the future has to overcome the cleavages of left and right and build a kind of radical center. What is interesting, however, I think very, very interesting and very French in that sense, is that the book he's written, and in France, books are written before elections by all candidates. It's called La Révolution, the revolution. Is there a way of being deeply reformist, let's put it this way, deeply reformist, and at the same time not go with the traditional reformist in the sense that the left uses the word reform, and at the same time not being part of the traditional left. When we look at how the traditional left has done many places, now except maybe in Germany things will be different, it has not done well, and clearly there's a search for a new model on that side. At the same time, on the conservative side, on the right of center side, many of the policies, and I'm sure others will talk about it, that President Trump was expounding during the election campaign, I'm not saying that he's actually implementing, because he's not really implemented many, or he's implemented very little so far in the American system. You can't do that overnight. But except for perhaps the climate issue and the executive orders relating to that, and even that is contested in the judicial system, he's also not very easy to classify as a traditional Republican or certainly not as a traditional Democrat. So is there something happening in politics where the underlying shift is such that the politics that we experienced 50, 60 years ago is no longer really what will be the politics of the future? In that context, although this is more focused on economics, but there is also, of course, the international, national dimension. We grew up in a world after the Second World War where institutions were built. The U.S. took a big lead in that. Institutions were built for global governance in an intergovernmental context, but nonetheless institutions that were aiming slowly, gradually, to build a set of global norms and rules to which countries would adhere to, whether they're big, powerful, or small. The WTO is, and the trade liberalization that came with it, and not just trade, but in a wide sense, the convergence in many economic regulations. I mean, it's far from perfect, but a certain convergence had a legal and institutional basis. Same for the European Union. I mean, the European Union was a mixture of intergovernmental negotiations, but also of European law that bound Europe together into a framework that was supranational and where there is a lot of sovereignty sharing. Are we moving away from that to a world of big players making big deals, and where the institutional aspects are much less important than the deals that are being made among the big players. And I think we'll see, but it seems like the second part of this has become very, very important. So these are 2 points that I think are relevant for all 3 elections, including other elections that are coming forward, that I hope we can address. Anne.
Okay, you remind me of the famous Cambridge, England physics tripos paper. Define the universe and give 3 examples, all in 10 minutes. Anyway, let me try, but there's too much on the table, and how we'll ever get there, I don't know. Quite clearly, the multilateral system is very much under threat, and I'll come back to that, because it seems to me that's central to any assessment of what the outlook is. But before that, I want to just cover some points that I think have to be made. The first of which is simply that whatever we say right now is subject, I think, to more uncertainty than would have been the case in almost any convocation like this, well, since World War II, if not before that. I mean, the uncertainty as to what will happen in the United States alone is sort of unbelievable. I'll say something about that. But we have the same about Brexit. We have the same not only about who will be elected, but what they will do in a number of countries, including elections coming up next year and the year after, not just this year. So in a sense, all of this is going on. And of course, the way the world economy evolves will influence those elections, and those elections will influence the evolution. So on both sides, there's a much greater degree, I think, of uncertainty than before. And in my mind, I'm an economist, and that's what I'll focus on, but in my mind, the overarching uncertainty, even for economics, is geopolitical. Unfortunately, given the way relations were established and so on and so forth, I think has been, if not ruptured, at least cracked. And with those cracks, there's a great deal more uncertainty, and if you look around the world, it's serious. We, of course, have the Middle East, which is already in open conflict, and there are problems there. But we also have, of course, a number of other areas where there are risks. Certainly, the Chinese-American relationship is not all I would like it to be at the moment. And I think there's a great deal of uncertainty in that particular relationship. And that pulls in much of the rest of Asia one way or another, which is perhaps unpredictable and certainly part of the overall story. But we then have Eastern Europe, and I have in mind particularly Ukraine. But one could also think of the Baltics, if indeed the Russians decide, as they might well, to do something once indeed there might happen to be something in, let's say, North Korea. And if you look around the world, there aren't too many places where you can sort of sit back and say, well, comfortably, they won't be affected very much by all of this. The geopolitical uncertainty, I think, is sort of so great that any economist trying to make a forecast of what happens to the system as such has to start by saying, look, what I'm talking about is fine, but it may be that I'm ignoring the elephant in the room. And in this case, that's the geopolitical stuff, which I think is very troublesome. So having said that, back to the multilateral system, Kamal also said some of it. I think one of the things the United States did after World War II, which was part of what I was always very proud of, was to move toward a system of rules, et cetera, at a time when the United States economically was incredibly dominant, much more so than now, and when we quite clearly would have had power to do things in any number of ill-advised ways in addition to what we in fact did. The rules under the WTO have guided international trade. And no matter what you say, quite clearly, the history of the world economy, not just since World War II, but since, let's say, 1700, has been very much a history of lowering trade, lowering transport costs, lowering communication costs, things like that, that opened up more and more trade, which then was followed by the reduction of tariffs, especially after World War II, in such a way that trade and linkages, economic linkages between countries and regions within countries are much greater than they ever were before. The costs of breaking that apart are almost unimaginable. The costs of moving outside of framework, as Kamal says, toward deals between major powers and things like this are almost unthinkable in terms even of what's going on now, not to mention some of the specifics which would be totally disastrous. And I have in mind, of course, the Trump administration's search for bilateral balance in trade, which is one where I think almost any economist would agree is absolute nonsense. Obviously, what's the Banana Republic going to do? They're going to have almost something terrible when they've got to import other things for other people. If they're specialized in one commodity, you can define what's going to happen in that. And bilateral balance is not something we want for. And some of the major trading routes in the world over time have been trilateral. And to give you only one reminder of how important that is, after the Second World War, the Europeans were engaging in bilateral barter trade. And it was American intervention insisting on setting up the European Payments Union, which allowed multilateral clearing, which was a crucially important part of getting the European economies going again after World War II, and it still is. So just to name one obvious threat to the system is right there. Protectionism is another one. And the U.S. is too big, I think, to talk about protectionism and not expect responses from other countries, in addition to the damage it would do to its own economy. Now, during the campaign, the president sounded very protectionist. At first, there was, at least in my mind, some hope that he might not carry through with it, and certainly his comments on the Chinese and currency manipulation, which were anyway sort of not carried out by the data at all. I mean, it was ridiculous, but forget that. But that I was kind of hopeful that that moderation would go elsewhere. The past week has seen it otherwise. The past week saw the vice president's comments in Japan and in Korea renegotiating the Korean trade agreement, and goodness knows that was a political battle there of major proportions. We also have, of course, then the comments in Japan, but now we have the whole steel thing. And because of steel security, we might have steel tariffs. Well, now, 21% of U.S. steel is imported. I cannot think of a way that you could derive a defense establishment need for even 40% of the U.S. steel supply, and 80% of it is produced at home already. How is this a national security issue? If you take into account quality, I could make the case even more strongly, but for lack of time, I won't. There are some kinds of steel which you can actually almost see through. They're so poor quality, and many of those are the imported ones, and they're not the ones you want for national defense in any event, or even for domestic products. So there are a lot of these things going on where it's almost inconceivable that they can be carried through without retaliation. And in the first instance, there would be problems even for American producers who use things like steel if its price goes up. I think there's a statistic to the effect that there are something like 121 workers whose jobs depend on using steel products as an input for every steel worker. 121 to 1. So now we're going to protect steel, raise its price, make us less competitive abroad. We export steel too, of course. And we export steel products. If foreigners can get a hold of steel at world prices and we pay more, our competitive advantage in other things will be lost, and whatever jobs you might think might be gained in steel, which is doubtful, they would be more than lost elsewhere in the system. And that's only one example. And if Kamal had given me an hour, I could try many more, but I don't think he wants me to do that. But the point is that we are threatening that. Threatening in and of itself has consequences for other trade policies. Reducing confidence in the WTO, where the dispute settlement mechanism has been very important. Reducing confidence in that is a negative for world trade even before anything happens. And some of that is already happening, and indeed, I think is a very serious threat to the continuation of that in the world economy. But I would argue that what's really happened is that for reasons that probably are more political, and I said I'm an economist, so this is amateur stuff, than economic, people who aren't happy for whatever reason look at two things that they think the government can influence. Why? Because it's not domestic voters. What? Trade and migration. Both of those are things that it looks as if the government has easy handles on, relative to things like just let's produce more in a state enterprise or something like that. The result of which is those are two on which I think voters have emphasized or have focused on or have listened to out of all proportion to their importance in terms of the degree of unhappiness now. Joe can correct me on this, but I don't think so. Most economists would argue that 80 to 85% of the dislocations in jobs and so on come about because of technical change and so on, and only secondarily does trade come into it. And of course, when trade dislocates in something, it creates opportunities in most cases in something else. And so it is not all on one side even then. But on the other hand, in the voters' minds, you can see the migrants, and there's a border, you can cut it off. You can see the imports, you can cut that off, forgetting that the exports will be reduced too, forgetting the other second-round effects, many of which would be enormous. So from my viewpoint, these are two areas where the political focus has been there. It's a search for something, perhaps something that never was and never will be, perhaps for something where we need to find policies otherwise. But whatever we want to do about the situation, I think the trade And severe cutbacks in migration are certainly not an issue that would play well either in the political arena once we saw the consequences, or that would play well in the geopolitical arena, or that would do very much about the problems that people may be unhappy about. There are other things we can do and probably should do. You could argue that our social safety net is not as strong as it should be, and I think I'd buy that. You could argue about education and what needs to be done to our system, because you could argue that earlier on we were increasing the fraction of educated at least as fast as automation was knocking people out, and now we're not doing that. We need to do more. I would be the first to argue that, but the trade and restricting trade and migration area seems to me to be a formula for making people worse off, not better off, for intensifying whatever geopolitical intentions there are, and so on. Is President Trump implementing everything? Not yet. On the other hand, the noises, especially in trade, are certainly very unsatisfactory, and the initial articulation of this and the initial actions, including the steel thing most recently, strike me as portending very poorly for the future and give me a great source of worry. So I'm uncertain. I hope that indeed reality will set in. I hope some of the advisors will be able to persuade him that perhaps this is not the way to go. But on the other hand, I remain more on the pessimistic than the optimistic side. Thank you.
Joe?
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me first make a couple preliminary comments about your general perspective. Where is the American economy? I actually think the most recent data coming in says that things aren't actually going as well. The markets had, sometimes call it a sugar high, in the belief that there would be a very big tax cut for business, in the belief that there would be very quick deregulations, particularly the banking system, allowing them to pay out huge dividends regardless of what effect it would have on financial stability, and ignoring totally all the issues that Anna's raised about what will do to America's global international relations and uncertainty about trade and trade wars and all that. What was striking about this, you might call this sugar high, was that it reflected, it showed that the market was almost as foolish as Trump, ignorant, you might say, in not understanding the complexity of American politics and the rule of law that we have in the United States. You can't just strip away regulations. You have laws. We have a regulatory process. It takes, Dodd-Frank was passed in 2010. It took 5 years to get the regulations in place. To take them away and to put new regulations implementing Dodd-Frank is not going to happen in 1 month or 6 months. It may not happen. And one of the reasons it took so long in many of these areas was there's litigation. Americans love litigation. And many of the things that victories that were viewed as victories against Obama are now being turned on their head. So just to give you one example, the executive order threatening cities who wanted to be sanctuary cities, saying that they would be denied funding for all kinds of purposes. San Francisco and Santa Clara sued. It hasn't been resolved, but the suit itself, how it's proceeded, is illustrated a lot. They used or at least behind the scenes is in an attack against Obamacare. In the part of Obamacare was a provision designed to encourage states to provide health care for their poorest in Medicaid. And, Obama realized that many states that are controlled by the Republicans had no concern about their poorest. and therefore, even if the government was paying 90% of the cost, they would opt out of Medicaid. It was outrageous, but so to make sure to implement that, they put, you might say, strong incentives for the states. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. That's disproportionate. And the result of that is that now a very large number of states did not provide extension of the Medicaid benefits to their poor. The prediction of what would happen was right. But now this is coming back to haunt them because the suit said you can't use disproportionate denial of benefits. So you could cut back aid to immigrants under this provision, but you can't say we're going to cut you out of government assistance. And the interesting thing is the government's defense is really quite remarkable. It said, the Justice Department, we never really intended to do what was in the executive order. What we're going to do is only deny $0 or maybe $1 million and only directly related. So the government is actually now saying the executive order doesn't mean anything. That was just visuals for assigning opportunity. What that highlights is the high degree of uncertainty we are in today, where we don't know exactly where we're going. But in terms of where the economy has gone in the first quarter, in spite of this stock market high, the numbers look like, they're not out yet, but the numbers look very strongly as if growth for the first quarter will be lower than it was for the first quarter a year ago, about 0.5%, and we will be going for a growth rate of 2%, half of what Trump talked about. And so there is a disconnect between optimism in consumer surveys and the numbers, the hard numbers that are appearing on the scene. Well, I want to comment first very quickly on the international issues, and Anna said most of what I wanted to say, and I agree with what she said. I want to highlight 2 points. First, the importance of rule of law. Everybody, and it's been a major theme in economics. It's not the only theme, but it's an important theme in economics, the importance of rule of law. And we talk about the rule of law domestically, but it's also true internationally. And that's what this rules-based system that the United States helped create in the aftermath of World War II. I've been a big critic of the rules. That is to say, I said often that the rules are not the rules that are fair to developing countries and emerging markets. But that's different from saying we want to go back to a law of the jungle. And I've worried about, is the voice of the developing countries, emerging markets adequately heard? So when you say the rule of law, you still have an important debate about what rules. But to say that a single country will single-handedly remove itself from the rule of law is dangerous from the global point of view. What has happened over a 70-year period is we worked very hard to create a world without borders, where goods can move across borders, services, capital. Not perfectly, borders. And the biggest thing that Trump has done is reminded everyone that borders do matter, and that the damage that Trump has done won't be erased, even if he doesn't do most of what he says he's going to do, because it has introduced a new element of uncertainty. Firms created global supply chains on the presumption that we were in an historical arc of lowering the pay, these barriers. When there's a debate about TPP or TTIP, that was only a question of further lowering them creating new standards, new regulatory standards, and again, I opposed a lot of the provisions. But the question there is, no one was really talking about getting rid of the WTO or saying that if the WTO has a ruling that we don't like, we wouldn't honor it, which is what the Trump administration has said. So the idea that you would walk away from international rule of law is just really amazing to me. In his, one of the reasons that the United States was able to play the role of leadership that it played for in the years after World War II was that it pursued what I called an enlightened self-interest. You know, Trump in his inauguration speech talked about America would pursue an America First agenda. You know, forget about the overtones of that particular speech, of what those words have meant. America has always put America first. And, you know, that's not, you know, when many people in other countries heard that, they said, what's new here? But the point is, it was always an enlightened self-interest, where we said that having global peace, stability, and open market was in our self-interest. And that meant, at the moment, we weren't fully short-sighted. Sometimes we were short-sighted, but we weren't fully short-sighted. And I take it Trump's announcement is to say America will become totally myopic in its behavior and just pursue our unenlightened self-interest. And that, of course, will be disastrous and mean that we can't perform any role of leadership. And that, I think, is not good news. One of the things that, as an economist, and Anne must feel this even more than I do, when you hear statements about trade that are so deeply uninformed that it must just send creeps up. You know, it's just, they're stupid. There's no other way. And there's just, Anne talked about one of them, that in a first year principles course you would have, which is bilateral trade deficits. You know, we invented money. We talk to our students about the great invention of money is so that you don't have to have bilateral exchange, the double coincidence of wants. And he wants to go back to that international. But there's another one that's equally important, and that is that trade deficits are economists point out that trade deficits are a result of macroeconomic imbalances, that they are related to a disparity between domestic investment and domestic savings, and that when domestic savings goes down, if domestic investment stays the same, there will be we have to borrow to fill in the gap, and that creates a trade deficit. And the equilibrating mechanism is the exchange rate. It took Trump a little while, I gather, to figure out whether a dollar going up or down was a good thing. And he finally got instruction that if you are worried about the trade deficit, you want a weak dollar. And that's the opposite of what Secretaries of Treasury usually talk about, which is a strong dollar. That's a little confusing, I understand, if you don't know any economics. But so he ordered the dollar to go down, and it didn't obey him. And that's one, you know, nobody told him that the president doesn't have a little dial that tells you, okay, I want the dollar down. In the closet, there's a little machine, and you then dial it down, and then the dollar goes down. So nobody told him that there wasn't that machine, and nobody told him it was quite that complex. this is a problem that many Secretary of Treasuries often find out about too, because they want it to go up sometimes they want to go down, and they discover that if you are not going to go down the route of those countries that try to have exchange controls, and that, I don't think we're going to go down that route. That, for a large country, would be an utter disaster. Mm-hmm. If you don't go down that route, you are going to, markets are going to determine the exchange rate, and they're going to determine, therefore, the trade deficit. There's an important consequence of this. Whatever you do on the protectionist side in one country is going to pop up somewhere else. Your trade deficit is going to be determined by the macroeconomics. So because the macroeconomics that he is advocating basically calls for bigger deficits, fiscal deficits, he will have a bigger trade deficit no matter what protectionist or non-protectionist policies he pursues. The protectionist policies are only going to affect the equilibrium value of the dollar, the distortion in the patterns of trade, and starting a trade war really disturb global supply chains and all kinds of, introduce a lot of uncertainty at the level of industries. So that, I think, is from a macro point of view, the most disturbing thing about that, the fact that he just doesn't get this. Now, I want to say something about why, in a sense, when I said we are here, why Trump, what were the forces that leading Trump to Le Pen? The reality is that a very large fraction of America, and in Europe it's not quite as bad, but have not done very well. Median income of a full-time male worker, and it's not easy to be a full-time job, but a full-time male worker, median income, is at the same level or lower than it was 42 years ago. Real wages at the bottom, real compensation, hour compensation at the bottom is roughly the level it was 60 years ago. The American economy has not performed for large parts of our society. An economy that fails that way is a failed economy. Health, we are life expectancy, the data for the United States last year is the life expectancy began to decline. And if you look at certain groups, it's in significant decline. This should not be, that's the kind of thing that happens in a society that's falling apart, like in the years after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the breakup of the Soviet Union. That's when you see these kinds of absolutely disastrous healthcare statistics. And we are now joining this group. So the question then is why? And Anna's right about the fact that we would be here whether there had been any globalization or not. Put it another way, the pace of productivity growth in manufacturing has been greater than demand growth, and that means that globally, manufactured jobs are going down. Globalization has made it worse because we will be getting a smaller fraction of those jobs. But there is an aspect of globalization that economists warned about, but our politicians didn't take seriously, and that is the basic economic theory, Samuelson-Stolper theorem, or the factor price equalization theorem, which says that when you open up trade between an advanced country like the United States and a developing country, emerging markets, the consequence is that unskilled wages fall. And that's through taking into account the fact that you can buy goods at lower prices. So that the real incomes, it is not a surprise that real wages of unskilled workers went down. It was predictable. It would have been a surprise if they hadn't gone down. And many of us warned about that and said we ought to do something about it, but it was impossible to get through a Republican Congress job assistance programs, let alone programs that would do something about the adverse distributional effects that trade was bringing about. So to me, the failure to deal with the distribution consequences of globalization are part of the reason that we are here, even if technology might have put us in a similar position, even if we hadn't had globalization. And finally, let me try to just very briefly come to the domestic issue of many of us thought that the 2008 crisis should have been a moment for the center-left parties because it showed that deregulation didn't work. What has happened in the third of a century, the last third of a century, since we tried supply-side economics, since we lowered the tax rates at the top, since we liberalized and deregulated, the economy has grown slower and there's been more inequality. And my view, it's a failed experiment. And the 2008 crisis showed, again, predictable instability in which most Americans lost a great deal. The puzzle then is, why haven't things worked out the way? In Europe, I have, well, in both cases, I think part of the answer is I think the center-left parties remained too centrist, and they didn't think deeply enough about what was going on, that you needed. The 21st century is different from the 19th century, and a lot of the language and a lot of the, we don't have the class-based society, we don't have the manufacturing ideal, of the post-World War II period, that's gone. Manufacturing is 8% of the employment. We're a service sector economy. The kinds of structures that have shaped our minds about what are the right economic structures have changed. And so my feeling is that the center-left parties should have rethought more the agenda, a more progressive agenda. It's not, based more on not the distinction between whether you're a worker or not, but because workers now own a lot of capital. That old distinction is no longer a relevant one. But the question is a middle-class lifestyle attainable? The fact is, it's becoming increasingly unattainable. There are things that we could do to make it more attainable. You have to ask, we are a richer country as a whole than we were after World War II, but many of the aspects of a middle-class life are less attainable. After World War II, we provided, under the GI Bill, free education to everybody who had fought in the war, which is essentially all males and a lot of women, at the best school for as long as they wanted. And today we can't even afford 2 years at the lowest cost school. And it's not because we can't afford it, obviously, it's where our mindset is. So we could go down the whole list of what would make a middle-class life attainable today. And I think that there is a progressive agenda that could achieve that. I think our analysis of why we have such an inequality is a little bit stuck also in the past. It's how we restructured the rules after in the last 35 years, weakening bargaining power of workers. We're too much stuck in a framework of a competitive market paradigm, whether that doesn't describe a 21st century economy. If you look at sector after sector, there are limited competition. So the bottom line is that we now, part of the progressive agenda is making sure that this middle-class life is attainable, and making sure that the rules of the market economy get rewritten. And I guess the final comment, okay, I'll just stop.
Thank you. Well, your agenda is detailed and structured, so you could go on for a long time, I guess. But we want to give it a chance also to the European side of things. Yeah.
Oh, all this also applies to Europe as well. So I don't want to say that.
That's the point. But yeah, all this discussion that comes from you listen to, and you know, both Anne and Joe agreed on many things. I'm sure they disagreed on other aspects. But what impact does it have on Europe? And particularly, one particular question which is, I think, interesting and kind of obvious, is why is Germany apparently such a contented country and with so little polarization, versus France being like the opposite? And when you actually look at the statistics, Germany has overall, I mean, if you make a statistical index, better statistics, but they're not. The difference is not huge, except in the employment side.
That's right.
But
yeah.
If you could comment a little bit on, you know, the European reaction to this American debate, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. So
because there was a time when oversimplifying Brexit and Trump meant a huge kind of tsunami of populism that will engulf the world, and we have now European elections coming. I mean, do you see that? How different is Europe? And particularly, why is it that in Germany you get so little polarization?
Compared to elsewhere. So I would just start with what Anne said, because I think it's very important, and Joe followed up on that as well, and that's the international trade, the openness, etc. And the sentiment you have in Europe is that Europe, and China as well, that you actually are, that's the bastion now of the relatively free trade, relatively open, etc. idea, and that's the role that, in a way, Europe has to play, the Chinese in their own way as well. So that's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. Perhaps a perspective just to keep in mind, you know, Europe and the US together are still not quite half of the world economy. It's closer to 40% now, but still those two blocks are extremely big. So what will happen in the US and in Europe will have, you know, dramatic consequences. And China, obviously, is the third major player, second if you take national economies, but so that has to be kept in mind. Now, in going into Europe back and seeing how Europe is reacting first to the internal major change with Brexit and the fact that Marine Le Pen would like Frexit, or at least voting on that and definitely taking things. So the extremists have very extreme ideas in Europe. It's just that they have, as Kemal says, have had different impact, or at least seem to have a different impact. The alternative for Germany would have extreme views, but most likely it will not play such an important part as the extreme views of Marine Le Pen or the extreme left in France would now, right? So there, I think, is a big difference. Now, where it is, I think you put your finger on. I think there is naturally kind of more diversity of opinion and more extreme expression of it in France historically than in Germany, let's say, speaking of the last 30, 40, 50 years in the sense of 1968 or, you know, things like that. But I think the really more important nowadays is the fact that Germany, through the Hartz reforms, essentially reformed labor markets and succeeded in keeping wages relatively from rising as fast as elsewhere, and reduced unemployment, which was 11%. It was similar to France and Germany 10 years ago, reduced it down. So what you have in Germany is a period of relative stability and prosperity that's shared in the sense that you don't have, as in Spain or some of the southern countries, huge number of unemployed and despondency, and that breeds then, of course, the more support for the views. So Germany, in a way, in this economic sense, and the way it has been governed, is an island of stability where, as I indicated, you know, we may have some changing of the guard and so on and so forth, but it's not really going to have that much of an impact. So in that sense, Europe and the broad differentiation is north versus south, but they're obviously.
Can I just say one thing about this?
Yeah.
That keeping wages low is like a competitive devaluation.
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of people in Germany don't view it that way, but it's just the same effect as a competitive devaluation.
But what is interesting is that the German workers and population has accepted that, okay, and was willing to go with it, whereas in some other countries that would be seen as explosive. And in a way, we saw the workers in the United States, many of them voting for Trump, who historically would have voted Democratic together with the trade unions and so on, and just were saying, look, this is enough, as you described it. Right?
And a word on France before you...
So yeah, I think that France is at a crossroads, that it's itself surprised how divergent, and especially now in the last few weeks and even days, the opinions have varied. How many people are undecided? Okay, that you have a huge 20% of people still are sort of going to be deciding. And interestingly enough, the front-runner Macron, who is the centrist candidate, the one who would kind of keep Europe going the way it has been going the most of all the candidates, is having voters who are very undecided, or who could switch at the last moment. So we really don't know what's going to happen on Sunday, and then what's going to go after that. Now, in the second round, it looks that if either Macron or Fillon moved into the second round against Marine Le Pen, they would likely win. So in that sense, the second round then would be much more assured. But even Fillon, for instance, he might change from his rhetoric during the campaign, but he would be for renegotiation of the Schengen agreements, for instance. Well, that was one of the main reasons for Brexit, was that Britain did not want to have the free movement of labor, right? So once you start then questioning some of the pillars of of what constitutes the European Union right now, then even an election of a relatively traditional candidate could actually trigger changes that might have consequences that nobody fathomed. And it's important, again, to have the perspective that this is the European project that has been built very carefully from the end of World War II, with the United States playing a major, major founding role in that. That really was. The Marshall Plan, part of it, it had aid, but it also had setting up of the rules, the trading, right? The fact that the countries started trading with each other and gradually improved dramatically the economic situation. So that whole thing is now imperiled to the point that nobody could have imagined just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Perhaps one additional point, though. Macron personally is an extremely pro-European candidate.
Right, exactly. So
I
I
mean,
think he would keep mostly
not only
Europe
keep, but
going.
he would want to move forward with integration on the Eurozone. Okay, so let's turn to the audience now for questions. Take a few questions and then go back. Ulrich, the first question, and then, sorry, I don't know whether your name is also Ulrich. No, okay. But please identify yourself before you ask the question.
Ulrich Heber, I'm teaching a course at the University of Maryland on the Euro debt crisis. And also, Kemal Dervish was my boss for many years, to continue this long with the boss. Jan, I want to address you directly, but also a little bit Professor Stiglitz. I think you're too optimistic when you talk about the stability in Germany.
Wow.
And by that I mean the workers have accepted relatively low wages, but they have not accepted that lots of people do not have permanent employment anymore, part-time employment. They're hired, they're loaned out. And it is also because the Social Democrats have not played, as you pointed out, their role as a workers' opposition party. I mean, nothing is more attractive for the Social Democrats today to stay in government. Germany is an important country that has no opposition in parliament. When you think about that, that explains why the workers don't have a right, and I wanted to ask you whether you think it's a good idea to continue. You seem to sound as if it was a good idea to continue with the current coalition. But more fundamentally, to all of you, it seems, or am I wrong there, that our democracies today are not capable of solving fundamental problems that meet the needs and concerns of the populations. In France, real social reforms seem to be impossible. In Italy, the north and south, the imbalance seems not to be solvable. Are our democracies today not capable of solving fundamental problems anymore?
I'm Peter Jungen. There's now finally some talk about Germany, and although that was in the title. To what has been said by Jan and Joe, I would agree to an extent. You talked about unemployment and the very positive unemployment development, particularly youth unemployment and all this. But I think there is more in this, and I would not accept the idea of the wage shrinking of wages in Germany. It's the second highest per hour, 37 euro, versus the US dollar in industry is what, 28 or 29 dollars per wage in industry. So it's the second highest in the Eurozone. The second is, the interesting thing is, the majority of the population favors globalization. I'm not going into details why it is so. Since 8 years, the Gini coefficient is shrinking in Germany. And the reason for that is for 8 years, an increasing labor market participation. Now, when people say that the median is down, well, of course it's the median down, because most of the people who got into the labor market were unemployed before 8 years ago. So they are not qualified people, and they're entering on a pretty low level. As a result of that, the average is down and the median is down, but it doesn't affect the people who worked 10 years ago. So I think one really has to look into this a bit more carefully. Maybe one of the reasons is that the country has a very high share of industry. It's about 23, 24% of GDP, but it's about twice as high than the US and the EU average. There's one country, Jan, in the in the EU, and that's your country. Czech Republic has a higher percentage of that, but that's the only one. And maybe, Joe, there is one point, is the reducing of government take, or the government share of GDP, which is pretty low in Germany compared to most of the Western countries. And maybe there is one of the reasons, and I know, I know you're not agreeing with Wolfgang Schäuble's policy, but it's now the 8 years where there is no government deficit in spending, public spending. So maybe there are some reasons why we should look more carefully in that development compared to the normal view all many people have on what these countries may do. And my last point is on the parties in Germany. I'm not commenting on what the SPD should do or not, but Mr. Schulz may have a chance to become the vice chancellor at best. And there are other options for coalitions in the country, but that would probably require more than two parties. The Liberal Party is coming back. With the Green, the Liberal, and the Christian Democratic, it's a majority. So actually, it's interesting to see that the German election is becoming much less exciting than the election in other countries, although it may be much more important than some elections in other countries.
All right. Yes, the lady in the back there first.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon from the New York Times. I'd like to ask the panelists, what particular protectionist policies have been embraced by candidates in France, and what should be the implications in transatlantic relationship?
Okay. Yes, there in the middle. Oh, and then you were actually, yeah, sorry, you'll be the next then.
Okay, thank you very much. Wolfgang Muno from Germany here at American Institute for Contemporary German Studies of Johns Hopkins University. I would like to first challenge you a little bit that the Social Democrat Party is not really a workers' party anymore. Very important has been also the introduction of a minimum wage in this coalition, which helped reduce also the Gini coefficient, especially for low-level workers. That was, I think, quite important. But basically, I would like to challenge the view that it's the labor market which was so important in Germany. And I would like to ask, if you compare it to Austria, which also has a very low level of unemployment, but the right-wing populist candidate in the presidential elections almost won just by a very narrow margin. So I would like to draw the attention away from economics and to, well, immigration, culture, politics, which plays an important role in France, in Austria, in many other countries, but not so much in Germany. And I think that has something to do with German history simply. And a question to the panelists, or two questions. I think a big problem for Europe is Italy. That's a big problem, and there may be also be elections very soon. And to the American partners here, I would like to know your opinion about Mexico and NAFTA, which is, I think, maybe the weakest target in trade for the new administration, and what you think about that. Thank you.
Okay, we have to close at 3:30 because there are other engagements. One last question there, and then a quick round.
Thank you very much. My name is Lorenzo Forni. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Padua in Italy, and I'm also the director of a think tank called Prometeia in Italy as well, and so I'm picking up on the Italian issue. So as you know, there are going to be elections at the latest in February next year. There's a heated debate now in Italy about whether the country should leave or not the euro. Luigi Zingales, who is a professor at Chicago, just called on a major Italian newspaper to open up a debate on that. I want to hear from Joe Stiglitz' opinion on that, because he's often associated with one party in Italy who is actually in favor of calling a referendum on the euro. And so please let us know your opinion. And from Anne, who is an expert on restructuring, I would like to ask you whether you think Italy should start planning for a sovereign debt restructuring.
Should start planning for?
Sovereign debt restructuring. And
Remember, you
and if yes, how would you move the first steps to do that? Thank you so much.
Okay, well.
Can I film your answer?
Sure.
Well, Joe, we'll let you answer first that one, and then, if you want to quickly, if you do want to answer the
Okay, I could just give a very brief answer to that question. I think, as I point out in my book, the euro has introduced rigidities which have contributed significantly to Eurozone's poor economic performance. It's led to a divergence between the richest and the poorest countries when it was supposed to lead to convergence, and it's led to divisiveness. But I also argued that the first best approach is to make the reforms in the structure. It's a half-finished project in a way. They knew it in the beginning, but you either have to have more euro or less euro, more Europe or less Europe, and this current halfway house, I think, is going to be very hard to sustain. So I think it would be better, and I don't think it's economically that difficult, to make it work. The politics are more complicated.
And read the book to understand why. And one last word, if you or two last words.
Three things I wanted to comment on quickly. The first is, can democracies not solve problems anymore? Democracies have always gone through periods where they had difficulties. They had to change the structure one way or another. I think of many in the United States, starting with the Whiskey Rebellion in 1796, but thinking also of the Jacksonian presidency, the Civil War, lots more, riots in Manhattan in 1900, and so on and so forth. Obviously, when things turn around a bit and there have to be changes, there can be periods where people are either not seeing the way forward and they have to debate it, or other things. So I don't think that it's an any more question, and I think that if we choose the wrong path, which I hope we don't, the lessons from that may be learned, and we'll finally get to the right one. I think it was Churchill who said you can trust Americans finally to find the right solution after they've tried everything else. So it may be that he was more right than he knew. Mexico and NAFTA, we don't know what is happening. The Mexicans seem privately to have gotten at least some reassurance on things. And on Canada and Mexico, so far, the Trump administration has not moved as much as he promised in the campaign. That doesn't prove he won't, but at the moment that's okay. I think the Mexicans have taken some measures already to try and be sure they're not quite going to be quite as much trouble as they might have been, but obviously it would be a huge blow for Mexico if this were done in a serious way. But the value-added chains, which Joe was discussing, are important in this. And there, I think there would be so much damage that I think there will be American companies that fight against it too, which would help a lot. Because what really happened after NAFTA for Mexico is they got into the value-added chains big time, which they didn't before, and disrupting that would disrupt them, of course, but it would also disrupt us. Last question, Italy and debt restructuring. Obviously, that depends in part on Italian law. It depends on other things. I do not think you can depend on the center, but the first thing to do is to sort of take stock of what you want to achieve, and then look at the parameters with Italian law as to what debt is under domestic law, what is international, and then you go from there. And a major step is hiring a good law firm.
That's good. That's good.
Jan?
All right, so quickly on the democracy not solving problems. I think there are two issues here. One is that competition has increased dramatically, and it's tougher for democracies to handle things when things are more competitive. There is less resources, fewer resources to go around, throw at problems. So I think that's where, you know, for instance, globalization has increased total wealth of the world, but there are a lot of people left behind, even in democratic countries. So I think you're right there. I think there is another issue that we're facing, and that's the issue of illiberal democracies, that you could have the mechanism of voting, etc., and yet very capable demagogues can get to power, get reelected, and you know, Orban in Hungary, and so on and so forth. You can sort of see it around the world, and so that's a big issue. Sort of liberties versus democracy, the mechanism of democracy. I think that my remarks about Germany, I didn't mean to insinuate that there wasn't enough diversity and that there wasn't all that. I just am thinking that it's not so far, at least, hasn't been channeled to incredible support for parties like the Alternative for Germany. That unlike in France, unlike in other countries where there is the channel and could lead to actually some of these people getting to power, in Germany, I don't think that's not likely as yet. So, but other issues I think are there, and the fact that, for instance, you have the more of part-time workers, etc. So the labor market issues I think are there, and that's important. The question about protection policies in Europe. So the candidates are on record. Marine Le Pen wants intelligent protectionism. So that means taxing imports. Having public procurement primarily from French companies, things like that. Fillon probably pro-free trade, although he hasn't articulated all that clearly. And Macron is supporting trade agreements such as the Canadian-European trade agreement. He would like to have something that he calls greater EU cooperation and integration to create protective Europe, whatever that would mean. So you know, there are issues around that. And finally, I think on Italy, my view, I agree with what has been said, but I think the big problem in Italy is the banking sector and the non-performing loans, which have been growing in importance as Italy has been going through a tough period for a long period of time. So even performing loans became non-performing. And how to resolve that big issue, which could be explosive for all of Europe, actually, starting in Italy. So I think that issue is to be there.
Joe,
and in return, I just want to say, Kemal was my teacher, so everything that I say here, he's responsible for.
Yeah, just a couple of other issues. I agree that the center-left parties, the Democratic Party in the United States, has not done as good a job representing interest of workers. And I feel the same way in Germany. You know, when I've gone, say, to some meetings in Germany with members of workers and members of SPD, it's very clear that the party official, there's a gap between where, it may be I have, the people who go to my talks are self-selected in a particular way, but at least at those meetings, there is a very clear gap between the party itself and the officials and a lot of the concerns of workers. And I feel that the Democratic Party has also failed to adequately address the issues. I wouldn't say, whether you call them middle class people or workers, I think there's been a gap both in language and in concerns. I don't think it's whether people don't expect governments to solve problems, but at least they expect them to be deeply concerned. Bill Clinton did a very good job saying, "I feel your pain," and he meant it, and I'm not sure they felt some of the candidates felt their pain in the way that they should have. There are always many factors that go into the success of a country. If you have an undervalued exchange rate because you're part of the euro, it gives you a certain advantage. And to me, I think having an undervalued exchange rate, IMF has said that Germany has it, so it's not just me that says Germany has an undervalued exchange rate, gives it a competitive advantage and is a source of economic growth. It's done a lot of things very well, but I don't think it's because it has a small share of government. When you do government shares, a lot of these depend on how you do the calculations and what so just without looking at German data, looking at American data, a lot of people say America has a small share too, but the healthcare sector, we have to pay for our own healthcare. You have to look very carefully on what fraction are retirement benefits in the public versus private sector. So all of this, it's not the size of the government share that is the key thing. And so in general, I think that's not what I look to. I think it has the undervalued exchange rate is a key factor. In terms of the share of the economy that's in manufacturing, there's a basic problem. Not all countries in the world can have 23% of their economy in manufacturing. So that's just, so that's not to say everybody should follow the German lead. That doesn't solve, because if we know that globally the share of employment in manufacturing is going to be relatively small. And it is very likely, or at least very possible, that will change when China moves up the value chain. As it was moving up the manufacturing value chain, it first took away shoes and apparel, and now as it's moving up, it's moving into machine goods, and that will present a challenge to Germany going forward. Kamal was looking at me and saying I should end, so let me just make one final comment about NAFTA. And no, you want me to stop?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so I think what Ann said is absolutely right. The rhetoric was during the campaign was terrible. Building a wall is terrible. The interesting thing is that it's not just that the Mexicans are feeling more confident. The markets are feeling more confident. If you look at what's happened to the exchange rate, it's recovered most of the loss. The peso dollar exchange rate is recovered most of the loss that happened after Trump's election, which is a statement to some extent that they think that there's not going to be a significant change. There have been proposals of how NAFTA would be renegotiated, and when you look at them, there's nothing really very deep or fundamental. And not a surprise, the United States has a trade surplus with Canada and a trade deficit with Mexico. We have a hard time. We have to claim that our trade surplus with Canada is morally good, while our trade that of Mexico with the United States is morally wrong. We're having a hard time, but Trump is very creative. because the way he's doing this is to say deficits in goods are one thing and deficits in services are another. And again, he ought to take Ann's course. Well, we'll explain that trading services is just as much, is more part of the 21st century than trading goods. And especially those of us in the education sector or the healthcare sector think that our sectors are an important part of the economy.
Thank you very much, Joe, and we have to close. Let me just say one word. We have Werner Hoyer, the president of the European Investment Bank, giving a presentation on the future of the European economy in about 25 minutes. So those of you who want to listen to that are most welcome to stay. There are some refreshments outside. But a warm round of thanks to the panelists, to the discussion.